The first sign that Jacob's world was about to change came with the sound of machinery where there should have been silence. One morning, instead of birdsong, he woke to the grinding roar of heavy equipment echoing across his land. At first, he thought it was road work, maybe county workers patching a stretch of asphalt nearby. But when he stepped onto his porch, coffee mug trembling in his hand, he saw bright survey flags staked across his pasture, a bold line cutting through the grass like a wound. His chest tightened as he followed the flags toward the spring, the very heart of his ranch, and his worst fear began to take shape. The HOA hadn't just come close to his property. They had come straight through it. Within days, crews arrived with steel pipes, trucks, and bulldozers, tearing into soil that had been in his family for generations. The spring, the life source that had nourished his cattle, his crops. His family legacy was being tapped, redirected, and claimed in the name of community benefit. He stood there powerless, forced to watch strangers carve trenches across land where his father had once walked, where his grandfather had labored, where every memory of his life was tied to the water that now rushed into someone else's control. The HOA had decided his heritage was just a convenience, an untapped resource they could seize for their system. And in that moment, as anger surged hotter than the summer sun, Jacob realized the truth. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was deliberate, calculated, and devastating. They had taken the one thing they thought he couldn't live without. But they had underestimated him. Because Jacob knew something they didn't. The spring wasn't just water. It was power, and soon he would show them what happened when they pushed a man too far. Long before the rumble of machines and the sting of betrayal, Jacob's ranch was a sanctuary. The kind of place where mornings carried the sound of songbirds, and evenings settled with the soft trickle of water from the spring that wound its way across the pasture. At 42 years old, Jacob had built a life defined by simplicity and hard work. His days followed a rhythm as steady as the seasons. Sunrise meant coffee steaming in an old tin mug, sipped slowly on the porch as the sky glowed pink over the rolling hills. After that, he would walk the fence line, his loyal border collie trotting at his side, checking for loose boards or straying cattle. To most people, it might have looked like chores, but to Jacob, it was ritual, an unbroken chain connecting him to his father and grandfather before him. The ranch wasn't just property, it was heritage. Every weathered barn beam, every patch of tilled earth held a story. His grandfather had fought droughts in the 1950s. His father had survived storms that tore through the valley in the 80s, and Jacob himself had spent countless hours restoring the spring-fed water system that nourished their cattle and crops. That spring wasn't just water, it was life. It was family. It was the reason the ranch had endured. Neighbors knew Jacob as the quiet type. He wasn't one for gossip or arguments. He kept to himself, waved when passing by, and lent a hand when a fence needed mending or a calf strayed too far. His reputation was simple, reliable, steady, fair, and in a community where HOA rules governed everything from paint colors to mailbox designs, Jacob's ranch stood slightly apart. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't uniform, but it was well kept, proud, and alive with history. Inside the modest farmhouse, memories hung on every wall. Faded photographs of rodeos, family gatherings, and generations standing proudly in front of the ranch house reminded Jacob of where he came from. His father's old tools still lined the workshop, handles worn smooth by decades of use. And in the evenings, when the chores were finished, Jacob would sit by the spring, watching the water ripple over stones, imagining his father doing the same years earlier. That connection, man to land, son to father, was the core of who he was. To Jacob, peace wasn't found in luxury or noise. It was found in the small victories, a calf born strong, a crop thriving under summer sun, the steady hum of cicadas at night. Life was quiet, yes, but it was rich in ways outsiders could never understand. And until the day the survey stakes appeared across his pasture, Jacob believed that peace would last. But subtle hints of change had begun to creep in. At HOA meetings, there were murmurs about modernizing infrastructure, whispers about how individual property rights sometimes had to be sacrificed for the greater good. Most neighbors brushed it off, too polite or too tired to push back. But Jacob noticed the way certain board members eyed his land, the water source that bubbled up pure and cold, flowing freely across acres they didn't own but certainly envied. Still, he pushed the unease aside. He had weathered storms before. He told himself that people respected boundaries, that property rights meant something. He told himself the land was safe. What Jacob didn't realize was that while he lived his peaceful life, the HOA was quietly planning something that would change it forever, and soon, that quiet rhythm of dawn coffee and spring-fed evenings would be shattered by a fight he never asked for, but one he could not afford to lose. It began with a letter, slipped into his mailbox with the casual cruelty of bureaucracy. The envelope bore the HOA's seal, sharp black letters against white paper that looked harmless at first glance, but Jacob's gut told him otherwise. When he tore it open, his heart sank. Notice of easement enforcement, the header read, followed by lines of cold legal language that seemed to erase decades of his family's history in a single stroke. The HOA claimed the right to lay a water pipeline through his property, citing a decades-old clause buried deep in community bylaws. Jacob felt his throat tighten as he read the words again and again, each sentence more surreal than the last. They called it a shared improvement, insisting the pipeline would bring stability and fairness to the neighborhood's water system. But Jacob saw the truth plain as day. It wasn't about fairness. It was about control. This was his spring, his water, and now they were telling him it no longer belonged to him. Anger rose in his chest like a storm, but beneath it was something worse, a crushing weight of betrayal. He remembered long evenings spent mending fences with his father. The pride in his dad's eyes when he'd handed him the keys to the ranch, saying, "This land is your inheritance, Jacob. Protect it." And now, with the stroke of a pen and the coldness of a letter, strangers were ripping that legacy apart. That night, he sat at the kitchen table, letter crumpled in his fist, staring at the survey flags outside his window. The bright neon markers glowed in the moonlight like an invasion, each one a reminder that the fight had already begun. He could almost hear the sound of the pipeline being buried before it even started. The HOA had made their move, and Jacob knew he couldn't ignore it, not this time. Because this wasn't just a rule. This was a violation, a trespass, a theft of the one thing his family had guarded for generations. The letter was meant to intimidate him, to corner him, to make him feel powerless. Instead, it lit a fire inside him that would not be put out. The next morning, Jacob stepped outside to the sound of engines. Trucks lined the edge of his ranch road, men in hard hats unloading supplies as if they already owned the land. Bright orange fencing was being hammered into the ground, cutting across his fields like a scar. Jacob's jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists at his sides. He marched toward the crew leader, a man with a clipboard and the smug assurance of someone who believed paperwork was stronger than heritage. "This is private property," Jacob said, voice steady but boiling with anger beneath the surface. The man barely looked up, tapping his clipboard. "HOA authorization. We're within our rights." Within their rights. Those 3 words hit Jacob like a hammer. He tried to argue, but the man simply shrugged and went back to barking orders, the workers driving stakes deeper into soil Jacob's family had nurtured for 3 generations. That night, Jacob sat with his wife Anna at the kitchen table. Her worried eyes searched his as she whispered, "What are we going to do?" The kids had gone to bed, but the tension in the house was thick, their once quiet home now overshadowed by fear. Jacob didn't have an answer, not yet. But he knew one thing, backing down wasn't an option. Days passed and the harassment escalated. First, letters demanding compliance fines arrived. Hundreds of dollars in penalties for obstructing community improvement projects. Then came the unannounced HOA visits, board members standing at his gate with clipboards, inspecting his land like vultures circling a wounded animal. Neighbors began whispering. Some avoided him altogether, afraid of being caught in the crossfire. Others sent quiet nods of support but never spoke out loud. The isolation pressed down harder than the fines. One evening, Jacob walked the perimeter of his ranch, the neon pipeline flags still stabbing through his fields like invaders. He felt his father's presence with every step, remembered the stories he'd told of defending the land during hard times, holding firm no matter what came. Jacob stopped at the spring, the clear, cold water that had sustained their ranch for decades. He knelt by it, the weight of the moment pressing on his shoulders, and whispered, "They can't take this." "Not while I'm still here." But the HOA wasn't slowing down. Bulldozers arrived on the outskirts of his land, their metal teeth chewing up earth like monsters ready to devour everything in their path. The sound echoed across the valley, drowning out the peace that once defined his home. Jacob stood on his porch watching them, fury and helplessness battling inside him. This was no longer about rules or bylaws. It was war. And yet, through the noise and chaos, an idea began to form. It was risky, bold, maybe even reckless. But it was the only way to show the HOA they had underestimated him. For the first time in weeks, Jacob felt a spark of hope. He wasn't just going to defend his land. He was going to strike back. The question wasn't whether he could stop them. The question was how far he was willing to go. The day of reckoning arrived like a storm over the valley. Jacob had spent weeks preparing. Every document cross-checked, every loophole explored, every HOA regulation dissected like a puzzle he alone could solve. He arrived at the HOA meeting with a binder in hand, heart pounding but mind razor-sharp, every step fueled by frustration, anger, and a simmering determination. The board members were already seated, their faces a mix of surprise and condescension, as though they had assumed he would bend under pressure like everyone else. Jacob's eyes met theirs, unflinching, and for the first time, the power dynamic shifted. He laid the binder on the table and began speaking, his voice calm but laced with authority. He detailed every infraction, every unfair fine, every unannounced visit, and every act of intimidation the HOA had leveled against him. As he spoke, he projected images on the screen, survey flags slicing through his pasture, photos of the spring, copies of letters demanding compliance, and timestamps showing violations of their own bylaws. Murmurs rippled through the room as neighbors peered over shoulders, some in shock, some in quiet admiration. Then came the final blow. Jacob calmly explained the legal maneuver he had executed days earlier. The spring, the lifeblood of the ranch, had been legally secured under his ownership, and the HOA's access was now frozen until a court ruling could be issued. Their bank accounts tied to this project had been restricted, cutting off any funding for the pipeline. The board members went pale. Whispers turned to panic as the realization sank in. They had been outmaneuvered, humiliated, and exposed in front of the entire community. The blonde woman, chair of the board, shifted uncomfortably, fingers gripping the edge of the table, while two men beside her avoided eye contact, their confidence evaporating. Jacob's voice never wavered. Every violation he cited, every threat he documented, every inch of intimidation he had endured was now evidence stacked against them. For months they had tried to break him with petty rules, harassment, and fear. Today the tables had turned. The room was tense, every breath sharp, every eye fixed on Jacob as he concluded, "This spring is not just water. It's life, and it's mine to protect. Your authority stops here." Silence hung for a heartbeat. Then the murmurs of neighbors swelled, the reality of the HOA's failure sinking in. Outside, people who had feared reprisal now nodded and whispered in admiration, realizing the power one determined individual could wield when armed with preparation, courage, and patience. Jacob closed his binder, heart still racing, feeling the gravity of the moment. The battle had reached its peak. He had won the immediate confrontation, but the reverberations would echo through the neighborhood for weeks, months, maybe years. The HOA had underestimated him, and he had delivered a decisive, undeniable blow. The spring was safe, the pipeline halted, and the community had witnessed firsthand that standing firm against intimidation could prevail. Yet even in victory, Jacob knew this was more than a personal win. It was a lesson in justice, strategy, and resilience. The dust settled slowly over the valley, but Jacob felt the weight of months lift with every step he took along the ranch's familiar paths. The pipeline project had been halted, the HOA's authority curtailed, and the spring, his family's lifeline, was finally secure. Sunrise painted the horizon in soft golds and pinks, reflecting on the clear water as if nature itself was acknowledging the restoration of balance. Neighbors began to emerge from their cautious silence, some approaching with tentative smiles, others nodding in quiet respect. The fear that had once hung over the community dissipated like morning fog, replaced by a cautious optimism that had been missing for far too long. Jacob walked to the spring, the cool water rushing over his fingers, a tangible reminder of what had been defended and preserved. Anna joined him, her eyes glistening with relief, and together they surveyed the ranch, the restored calm, and the reclaimed peace. The HOA board members were no longer the looming threat they had once been. Some had resigned quietly, unable to recover from the public humiliation. Others were placed under scrutiny, their powers diminished, forced into transparency and accountability. Jacob had not only defended his property but had catalyzed change that rippled through the neighborhood. Community meetings shifted from tense, controlled gatherings to forums of dialogue and mutual respect. Rules were clarified, guidelines made accessible, and residents felt heard rather than suppressed. Children played safely along the edges of the fields, neighbors conversed without fear of retaliation, and the ranch, once a battleground, became a symbol of resilience. Yet for Jacob, the impact was deeply personal. He had reclaimed his father's legacy, yes, but he had also rediscovered his own strength, resourcefulness, and conviction. Every sunrise, every step along the dock, every drop of water from the spring now carried a sense of triumph and liberation. The months of harassment, intimidation, and fear had forged him into a man capable of standing unwavering against oppression, proving that courage paired with strategy could topple even the most entrenched systems. As the evening settled over the ranch, Jacob looked across the fields at his home, at the peaceful waters, and at the slowly reawakening community. A soft wind rustled the leaves, carrying with it the silent acknowledgement that justice had been served, not through vengeance alone, but through careful, deliberate action. He knew challenges might arise again. HOAs rarely relinquish power entirely, but the story of this victory would echo, a lesson in determination, vigilance, and the power of one person to protect what is rightfully theirs. Jacob's hand rested lightly on the railing of the dock, eyes fixed on the horizon, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. He had defended more than water and land. He had defended dignity, legacy, and the very principle of fairness. And in that moment, surrounded by the restored beauty of the ranch, the supportive glances of neighbors, and the enduring legacy of his family, Jacob understood that true victory was not measured in confrontation alone, but in the peace and respect earned through standing firm. The ranch, the spring, and the neighborhood had all found their balance once more, and for Jacob, this was the sweetest triumph of all. The dust finally settled across the ranch, and a quiet sense of relief washed over Jacob as he walked along the familiar paths he had once feared would be lost to the HOA's relentless pressure. The spring, the lifeline of his property, ran freely again, its cool waters reflecting the golden hues of morning sunlight. The pipeline project had been completely halted, and the board members who had sought to intimidate him were now powerless, some resigning quietly, others stripped of authority, forced into transparency. The neighborhood, once clouded with tension and whispered judgments, slowly began to breathe again. Neighbors approached Jacob cautiously at first, offering nods of respect, small smiles, and quiet words of encouragement. Children played freely along the edges of the ranch, and community meetings transformed into open discussions rather than arenas of control. The fear that had gripped the residents melted into a cautious but growing trust. For Jacob, this victory was deeply personal. He had not only reclaimed his father's legacy, but had also proven to himself the power of preparation, courage, and resilience. Each morning, as he tended the fields and watched the water ripple across the spring, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in months. The ordeal had been grueling, testing every ounce of patience and determination. But it had also taught an invaluable lesson. Standing firm with clarity and strategy could overcome even the most entrenched systems of control. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, painting the lake with shades of amber and gold, Jacob paused on the dock, looking across the serene waters. The neighborhood had changed, the spring was safe, and he had emerged stronger, wiser, and unwavering. Sometimes justice doesn't come quickly or easily, but when it does, it is all the more profound. And in that moment, surrounded by restored calm, the enduring lesson was clear. Protecting what is rightfully yours requires courage, persistence, and the unwavering belief that one person can indeed make a difference.